MyBookie.ag. Boys and girls, we have finally arrived at UFC 273. A solid card, but let's be honest, it's getting carried heavily by those last 3 fights. And as we know, those 3 have some ridiculous odds to them. Alexander Volkanovski is a 7-1 favorite, which is one of the biggest you can get in an MMA fight. Petr Yan is a 5-1 favorite, and so is Khamzat Chimaev, 5-1 favorite. I do not agree with any of those odds. Those 3 right there are a gold mine for anybody who bets on fights. On this card, we got, in my opinion, the 2 best fighters in the UFC, Petr Yan and Alexander Volkanovski. There's a total of 13 fights on the card, which is relatively normal. A lot of pullouts on the card. Gavin Tucker versus Pat Sabatini was cancelled. Albert Duraev pulled out a fight against Anthony Hernandez. And then the one we're all pretty bummed about. Kelvin Gastelum had 2 different fights on this card. First one against Imavov, which was an excellent fight. That didn't get put together. Imavov was not able to make it. And then they tried to do a replacement fight with Duplessis, and that ultimately got cancelled as well. That was a pretty heavy blow on the card, to be honest. But we do have the 2 championship fights still. We have the big Khamzat Chimaev and Gilbert Burns fight. There's a lot of noise on Ian Garry, and everything else is relatively regular, which means that the prospect of the night is definitely going to be Ian Garry. He's one of the lone prospects of the entire card. He's going to have to outperform a lot of the veterans on this card. The guy's big for the welterweight division, he's powerful, and he's exciting to watch. The fighter of the night. We got champions. But let's be honest here, it's Khamzat Chimaev. He's the main attraction to the card, he's in the fight that most people are looking forward to, and you don't normally see someone who isn't even in the top 10 being more anticipated to watch than champions on the very same card. Now the banger of the night, I believe, is going to be Ian Garry versus Darian Weeks. Both guys have ferocious power in their hands and tend not to be in a boring fight. The fight of the night, I'm gonna be honest, there's not a lot of fights on here that look like they're gonna be competitive, but I'm gonna have to say it's going to be that main event. Alexander Volkanovski versus Chansung Jung. I believe it's the potential to be the closest fight on the card, with a lot of danger involved, a lot of skill, and a fight between 2 vets of the game. And with that, we're gonna go right to our first fight, Ian Garry versus Darian Weeks. Props to the matchmakers for putting this one together. I mean, these 2 guys are huge for that welterweight division. They have a lot of power. Both usually get it done using their hands, but Garry is much more of a kicker, and Weeks has a wrestling game, so it's really going to stifle a lot of Garry's retreating clinches that he usually goes to. If he starts doing that against Weeks, I think he's going to get overpowered, as I do think that Weeks is the stronger fighter in there. I mean, Darian Weeks has a wrestling background, he also has a boxing background, and that's going to cover a lot of areas of the game that Garry is good at. But the biggest issue with Darian Weeks is that he does not check leg kicks. That is the path to victory for Ian Garry. Kick this man's legs non-stop. Weeks has a narrow stance, he just marches forward, doesn't really cut off the cage, and that's going to give a faster fighter like Ian Garry a major advantage at using his footwork to get angles so he can land those leg kicks. And when the damage starts adding up, as Weeks is trying to wink out those big left hooks like he tried against Brian Barberena, there's going to be a lot of opportunities for Ian Garry to counter Darian Weeks with that straight right hand. Same kind of punch he knocked Jordan Williams out with and many other fighters in the past. Not only that, the leg kicks can also be masked up into head kicks later in the fight, and the farther this fight goes, the worse I believe is going to be for Darian Weeks, considering the leg damage. Weeks is going to have to be aggressive right from the start. He does not want to back up, he does not want to allow Garry to move around in the cage. He needs more cage generalship and put some early aggression on this guy, pump out jabs, a lot of feints and stuff like that, because Ian Garry does not have any head movement. And not only that, he drops his hands when he's moving backwards. So aggression is going to have to be key for Darian Weeks, whereas leg kicks are going to be key for Ian Garry. But ultimately, my prediction for this fight, I'm going to have to side with Ian Garry, and I'm going to go by a 2nd round knockout. I think the leg damage is just going to be way too much, and ultimately that's going to set up his counter shots. And I don't see Weeks really cutting off the cage too well, so there's a lot of freedom for Ian Garry to do what he wants, and that's ultimately why I'm going to have to go with him. Now, he may be too much of a favorite. Minus 350 is a bit too much, considering the fact that if Weeks connects clean, he can absolutely knock Garry out. And the game plan to fight Ian Garry for Darian Weeks is not the hard one to come up with. And then we go to the fight everybody is waiting for. Gilbert Burns versus Khamzat Chimaev. We finally get to find out how good Khamzat Chimaev actually is. Now, Gilbert Burns is known to be somewhat of a glass cannon. He's super dangerous everywhere in the game. His punches are devastating, his kicks are powerful, his jiu-jitsu is insane, his wrestling's decent, but he just cannot take a shot. And not just that, he often doesn't even move his head unless he's throwing punches with it. Whereas Khamzat Chimaev, it looks like he has a pretty good chin off of the punches that we see him get hit by, and he has devastating power. I've been saying for weeks now that I have no idea what to think about this fight. I never knew who to pick out of these two because the fight can absolutely go any which way. And the fact that we still don't know too much about Khamzat Chimaev, it is impossible to make a confident prediction here without believing in Khamzat's hype and ultimately falling on Gilbert Burns' chin, because that's the main thing going for Khamzat Chimaev in my opinion, at least to what we know of. Khamzat's one-shot knockout power, legit scary hand speed, and really good at throwing punches down the center. He has a deceptive jab as well, and we all know that Gilbert Burns does not take his head off the center line unless he's throwing overhands. If Burns is throwing an overhand, that's his head movement. And number 2, Burns has no chin. He takes a right hand from Khamzat, this fight's over. It could be an uppercut, which is something that we saw Khamzat drilling in preparation for this fight, or it could be a signature right cross, and those punches come out quick. Burns is going to have to be a bit aggressive in this fight, not super aggressive where he runs into shots, but at least get some respect out of Khamzat Chimaev to try to move him backwards somewhat, using his feints, using his footwork speed, trying to kick at the legs and stuff like that, because Burns is the fighter that has the most confidence in this entire weight class to kick at Khamzat Chimaev without being too worried about getting taken to the ground, as Burns' Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is next level. We haven't seen too much of it in the welterweight division. It is a bit alarming that he wasn't able to submit Wonderboy Thompson, but when you do look back in that fight, he was obviously trying to stall out to a decision, but you also do have to give credit to Wonderboy Thompson for improving in his grappling to shut things down. If you can't do things to Wonderboy Thompson on the ground, it's not a good look going into a fight with Khamzat Chimaev, because if Khamzat takes Burns down, what's that going to look like? We don't see anybody taking Burns to the ground. The only time we saw him working his guard from his back was when Kamaru Usman dropped him. He was already compromised by then. If Khamzat drops to Gilbert Burns, the fight is probably over. It doesn't really matter what Burns can do off his back. But if Khamzat single legs him and takes him to the ground, we have no idea how this is going to turn out. And ultimately, we're all just going to be in for a treat. But here's the thing, man. Khamzat also generally doesn't move his head too much. He likes to put up a guard. With 4-ounce gloves is not usually the best move. He tends to like to parry punches, but Gilbert Burns does throw out some feints. He's also very fast for welterweight, and he can have some tricky footwork as well. The other thing is his head kicks are very deceiving. I mean, look at the way he was able to catch Kamaru Usman with a head kick. Usman did not really see it coming at all, and he really masks it well behind leg kicks. I can absolutely see a scenario where Burns fakes a jab, gets Khamzat to drop his hand to parry, which Khamzat does often. He always likes to parry jabs, and that creates an opening for Burns to land an overhand right and drops Khamzat Chimaev. I can definitely see that scenario happening. And another thing is, what if Burns tries to take Khamzat to the ground? I don't necessarily see it happening, but it could definitely open some things up. Perhaps getting some respect out of Khamzat's takedown defense to anticipate some takedowns, and that can open up some of Burns' punches. As we all know, Burns is always faking takedowns. He's always lowering his stance in front of his opponent, and generally off of reactions, he's able to land his shots. And in the scenario that Khamzat is too aggressive, Burns always has that check left hook ready. The same one he was able to catch Kamaru Usman with, and the same one he was able to knock out Damian Maia with. It's extremely fast. And even talking about it, I still am not too confident in picking for this fight. But if I'm going to have to make an official prediction, I'm going to have to go with Gilbert Burns, and I'm going to go by a second round submission. I see the scenario of Khamzat being a little bit too aggressive, maybe showing some of his inexperience in the cage, and he runs into a right overhand, potentially even trying to parry a jab. Khamzat gets dropped and choked out. That's a scenario I'm probably going to go with, but I'm not confident in it at all. Like, I can absolutely see Khamzat knocking this guy out, or even taking him down and ground and pounding him. But one thing I do think is for certain, Khamzat's not a 5-1 favorite. That is egregious. So I'm ultimately going with Gilbert Burns, second round submission. And then we go to the co-main event. Aljamain Sterling, the champ, versus Petr Yan 2. This is going to be the rematch, and it seems like a lot of people now are starting to pick Aljamain Sterling's side, or at least give him more credit, a higher chance of winning in this rematch. Here's the thing, man. We saw how the first fight was going down. Sterling had a good start of just unloading and expending the gas tank, ultimately overwhelming the activity in the fight, while Petr Yan usually takes the first 2 rounds to figure you out. So of course Sterling was going to win the early rounds off of that. It's just due to styles. But now that it's a rematch, these two guys are going to have to make adjustments, and Petr Yan already knows how Sterling fights. Not necessarily with the fast pace early on, but he knows the way Sterling throws punches. He knows the way he throws kicks. He knows the way he attempts takedowns. He felt all of it in the fight. So expect Petr Yan to come out the gates faster than before. There's not as much data downloading like it was in the first fight, because even though he was preparing for Sterling in that first one, he had to feel him out in the fight. He felt him out from that first one, now he's going into the second one, and he's further prepared. Does that mean he has a bigger advantage in the fight? No, not necessarily. necessarily, because if he comes off faster, Sterling doesn't necessarily have to come off faster himself. He can attempt to pick out some openings that Petr Yan is going to present. But do you know what the biggest issue was? Sterling got this guy down one time in the fight and barely had any control. He attempted 17 takedowns and only got one of them for a brief moment. And that was in the first round where Petr Yan is at his weakest. First round Petr Yan in this one is going to be stronger than first round Petr Yan of the first fight. And Sterling tried all the takedown attempts he had, and almost none of them were succeeding. And Yan was able to take down Sterling relatively easy, even in the first round where Sterling was his strongest. That's the biggest issue coming into this fight. The main way I could see Sterling winning this, if somehow his cardio became 5-round ready to go at a fast pace, keep up the activity with his longer punches, a lot of jabs, right crosses, switching his stances, head kicks, all of that has to be active for 5 rounds. Or he tries to find a head kick or a flying knee or something like that to intercept Petr Yan, attempt to get his back off of some kind of imbalance, and attempt to choke him out. But let's be honest, Petr Yan has way more paths to win this fight. His boxing is far superior, his kicks are far superior, he has more power, he's faster, he has better understanding of range, he has the higher fight IQ, he's a better wrestler, he's decent at cutting off the cage, and he has better cardio. And Sterling's defense generally tends to be awkward footwork as well as his reach. And Yan was able to figure that out pretty quickly in that first fight. This one is going to be even easier for him, I believe. So ultimately, my prediction for this fight, as long as Petr Yan does not get disqualified, I think he's going to win this fight by a 4th round TKO, because even if Sterling comes out in this fight slower than before, he's just going to give those early rounds to Petr Yan, and he cannot do that, because Yan does not slow down, so trying to get him out later is not in his benefit. So ultimately, I'm going to go with Petr Yan, 4th round TKO. I think he's going to finish what he started in that first fight. And then we go to the main event. Alexander Volkanovski versus the Korean Zombie. Korean Zombie gets another try at becoming the first Korean champion, second Asian champion in UFC history. And if he loses this one, I don't think he's ever going to get back to the title again. He's not a young guy. He's at the peak of his career. And if he wants to become a champion, he has to put it all on the line against Volk. In many people's eyes, the true pound-for-pound #1 fighter in the world, Volkanovski, going up against a longtime vet, former title challenger, longtime contender Chan Sung Jung, who has legit one-shot knockout power, but it generally comes only in those early rounds. The further the fight goes, the worse his precision and his punches get. And we did see Volkanovski get dropped by Max Holloway in those first 2 rounds. Korean Zombie has one of the best counter shots, especially against jabs, in the entire UFC. I mean, remember how he knocked out Dennis Bermudez? Slipped on the outside of the jab, landed the uppercut up the center. A very similar exchange that happened when Volkanovski got dropped by Max Holloway, as Volkanovski oftentimes will dig in a little bit too much with his jabs, and he's ultimately fighting the king of countering jabs. And not only are Korean Zombie's hands dangerous, his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is going to be also extremely threatening against Volkanovski in case Volkanovski decides to take this fight to the ground, which I don't think would be in his best interest until it's later in the fight. Volkanovski's going to have to try to kick out his legs, trying to land those big shots, as Korean Zombie doesn't have the best head movement at times, especially against power punches. And as we all know, Volkanovski has a precise overhand right. And I see that shot landing throughout the entire fight. First round is going to be a little bit dicey, but second round onward, Volkanovski's right overhand and leg kicks are going to be key to victory here. And that's what I see happening. Ultimately, my prediction for this fight, I'm going to have to go with Alexander Volkanovski, and I'm going to go by a 3rd round TKO. I see Korean Zombie having a hard time defending that right overhand, and also not checking many kicks. I think the feints are going to be frustrating for him, and it's going to open up a lot of Volkanovski's offense. Volkanovski's going to have to watch out from those early counter shots, because I don't agree with Volkanovski being that big of a favorite. There's a real level of danger fighting Korean Zombie in those early rounds. I can definitely see a scenario where Korean Zombie catches him with an uppercut or a hook first or second round and causes that huge upset. But at the end of the day, I do think Volkanovski should have a higher chance of winning this. Not as high as being a -700 favorite. He's the biggest favorite on the entire card by far, and it really is a bit disrespectful to Korean Zombie, who poses a lot of dangerous problems. And like we mentioned before, those last 3 fights have some ridiculous odds. And if there is going to be an upset, there's a huge opportunity to win big. Go to mybookie.ag to capitalize on this, because these are kind of odds that you're not going to see on cards. I can put it in perspective for you. Not saying to do this, but hypothetically, if you were to put $1 on a parlay having Burns, Sterling, and Korean Zombie winning, you can bank out at over $100. Just putting $1 can give you over 100. Or let's say if you go with two of the underdogs, let's say Burns and Korean Zombie, putting $1 down, you could potentially win over $23. If you want to go a little bit further, a little bit more strategic, you know that Korean Zombie's best way of winning the fight is most likely by a knockout or a submission. So going by the prop that Korean Zombie wins by a knockout, TKO, DQ, or submission, as well as putting like Burns to win the fight in general, because it's hard to tell that which is the most likely way that Burns would win that fight. He could even potentially win by a decision, because that fight is 3 rounds. You could potentially win out on over $32 by putting down 1. Or if you were to put down $10, you could potentially win on over 327, just multiples, right? That's where the gold is on the card. But everywhere else besides the Ian Garry fight where he is a massive favorite, the rest of the odds are relatively close. A lot of 115 to 115, minus 125s, minus 120. There is a huge opportunity to win big on this card, and for those who want to bet on fights, I definitely recommend you jumping on mybookie.ag because you don't see cards like this that often. There's good props, there's good parlays you could put together, and all you gotta do is jump on mybookie.ag, use the promo code WEASEL to activate the first deposit bonus. By using the promo code, your first deposit gets doubled all the way up to $1,000. You put down $50, you get another $50 of free money to play with. Of course, the more money that you put up as your first deposit, because this only works for the first time, the more money they will match. Again, go to mybookie.ag today, as this is a huge opportunity. And that's the end of the prediction, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up. If you enjoyed my content, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.